Section 2 of Richelieu by George Joseph Gustave Masson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 1, Early Days, the French Court, Part 2. The death of the Duc de Luynes restored to Mary de Medici part of her influence and brought about her reconciliation with her son. She took advantage of the circumstance to obtain for the Bishop of Luçon that long-coveted prize, the cardinal's hat, and toward the beginning of 1624 he was appointed to a seat at the council board. The war against the Huguenots had not ceased with the death of de Luynes, and Louis XIII. Was carrying it on with a considerable amount of vigour. Finally the Duc de Rohan managed to conclude with the king a peace which renewed the Edict of Nantes, but prohibited the meeting of political assemblies, and left to the Protestants as places of safety only La Rochelle and Montauban. The condition of France had become deplorable. The aristocracy, taking advantage of the weakness of the young king, held him, so to say, under their tutelage, and ruled with absolute authority in the large and important provinces of which they had the command. The Huguenots, although crushed for a season, had skill, energy, and resources enough to carry on a civil war. The foreign policy of Francis I. and Henry IV. was abandoned. Finally, the House of Austria, inaugurating the 30 Years' War by a series of victories, seemed destined to enslave Europe, after having crushed the Protestants in Germany. With the accession of Richelieu to office, all these causes of uneasiness speedily vanished away. In the course of 2 months he had renewed the ministry, expelled a worthless favourite, La Vieuville, subdued Louis XIII. By the vigour of a superior mind, and sketched out a plan of the political system he meant to follow. Experience, says Fontenay-Mareuil, has shown how right he was when he felt himself qualified for the discharge of public business, and yet in his youth he appeared very far from such thoughts, talking as he did of hardly anything but the affairs of his diocese. Nevertheless, he was always preparing for the eventualities of political life, thinking sometimes of what he would do if he was called to it. He would not plaster up things as so many had done before him, but bring efficient remedy wherever it was wanted, and work for the future, not for the present alone. Voiture's testimony to the cardinal minister is so striking and so cleverly put that we cannot help quoting one passage from it. When, 200 years hence, those who come after us shall read in our history that Cardinal Richelieu has pulled down La Rochelle and destroyed heresy, and that by one treaty, as by one cast of the net, he has taken 30 or 40 of its cities, when they learn that during his administration the English have been defeated and driven out of France, Pignerol conquered, Casale relieved, the whole of Lorraine united to the crown, the greater part of Alsace placed under our power, the Spaniards defeated at Vélan and Aven, when they see that so long as he has presided over our affairs, France has not had one neighbour whom she has not vanquished on the battlefield, and from whom she has not conquered cities and provinces. If, I say, our posterity have one single drop of French blood in their veins, and if they boast of some love for the glory of their country, will they be able to read these things without conceiving affection for him? And further on, let us see if he was not within an inch of pulling down that great tree of the House of Austria, and whether he has not shaken to its roots that trunk whose 2 branches extend to the north and the south, and which affords shelter to the rest of the earth. Thus it is that true patriotism can purify the style of even the most indifferent writer, and that in celebrating the greatness of France Voiture forgot his concetti and his intolerable mannerism. Richelieu has himself explained the views he had on state affairs and on the condition of France in so clear and striking a manner that his remarks deserve to be given here. "When your Majesty resolved upon admitting me to your council, and honouring me with your confidence, I can truly say that the Huguenots shared the nation with you. The nobles behaved as if they were not your subjects, and the most powerful governors of the provinces assumed the pretensions of independent sovereigns. I can also add that foreign alliances were despised. I promised your Majesty to employ all my industry and all the authority you were pleased to confer upon me for the purpose of ruining the Huguenot faction, taming the pride of the aristocracy, and raising your credit amongst foreign nations to the point where it should always be." In order to carry out this policy, Richelieu displayed all the resources of a clear intellect, a mind fully capable of grasping the ensemble of a subject, and on the other hand of following it out through its minutest details. His activity was unwearied, and his iron will crushed every object that stood in its way. He is reported to have said, "I meditate for a long time before taking a decision, but when I have once made up my mind, I go boldly on to the object of my aim. I mow down everything, and cover everything under the folds of my red gown. Je fauche tout, et je couvre tout de ma robe rouge." Before attempting to trace in detail the application and results of Richelieu's policy towards the Huguenots, the aristocracy, and the foreign powers, we must introduce our readers to the principal dramatis personae in this history, and cast a glance at the French court. Louis XIII. Was neither enlightened nor firm enough to work unaided for the good of his subjects. He conscientiously desired to do what was right, but he lacked energy. He appreciated grave and useful schemes, but Providence had denied him the strength to carry them out. Fortunately, he encouraged with all his authority those who possessed the gift of action, and his constitutional indolence was delighted at being relieved from the responsibility of initiating even the simplest plan. Some critics have questioned his courage, but this accusation is absolutely groundless, and on several occasions when he took command of his troops, he was blamed for exposing himself recklessly to danger. His knowledge of military science was very great, especially in the management of sieges, the raising and planning of fortifications, and the directing of artillery. He cared little about pursuits of a literary character, and took no part in the foundation of the Académie Française, the progress of the drama, and the other manifestations of intellectual life, which Richelieu, on the contrary, fostered and encouraged by every means in his power. Moral, high-principled, scrupulously attached to his religious duties, he was too apathetic to cope with so determined a will as that of the cardinal, and although he evidently felt the inferiority of his position, yet on the other hand he accepted it from the sense of his incapacity, and because he knew that Richelieu after all was actuated by a genuine desire for the glory and prosperity of France. Music and hunting were his chief pastimes, and his extraordinary accuracy of aim with the arquebus suggested to a wit a jeu de mots which we reproduce here in the original. Someone having remarked on the epithet juste bestowed upon the king, "Oui," replied the wit, "juste à tirer de l'arquebuse." The jealousy and suspicion which formed the leading features in the character of Louis XIII. Were for him a constant source of misery. He dreaded his own mother, whom he allowed to die in destitution and in exile. He dreaded his wife, his brother, those in fact whom he chiefly honoured with marks of his favour. It was with a positive sense of relief that he heard of the death of Constable de Luynes. and the condemnation of his cher ami Saint-Mars found him completely indifferent. If the pale, dull image of Louis XIII. Leaves upon our mind nothing but a feeling of compassion and regret, contempt is the only word which expresses rightly our opinion of his brother Gaston, Duc d'Orléans. Let us listen to what a keen observer says of him. With the exception of courage, he had all the qualities which constitute the gentleman, but fright showed that weakness had taken possession of his heart, and irresolution proved that it had also conquered his mind. He joined all the plots against the cardinal, because he had not the strength to resist those who dragged him into them, and he invariably managed to get off disgracefully, because he lacked the energy to support his associates, de Retz. It is not too much to say that the Duc d'Orléans was unconsciously the best helper Richelieu had in his efforts to crush the power of the aristocracy. Chalais and Montmorency, Saint-Mars and de Thou fell victims to the suggestions of a worthless prince, whose ambition was only equalled by his pusillanimity and his love of pleasure, especially of gambling. The Queen Mother must not be forgotten in this brief sketch. Of a violent and haughty temper, fond of power and impatient of control, she had encouraged Richelieu in his early steps towards political authority, and had been the first artisan of his fortunes. As soon, however, as she saw him gaining over the mind of Louis XIII. The sway which she supposed was her privilege and her right, she openly stood out as his enemy, and waged against him a war which, fortunately for the country, she was not able to carry on. His policy toward the Spaniards particularly irritated her. She had placed herself under the spiritual direction of Father de Bérulle, who, acknowledging no authority than that of the Vatican, could not understand Richelieu's taking the Protestant side in the 30 Years' War. Catholic alliances, he sincerely believed, were the only ones which the most Christian king should accept, and he had no difficulty in bringing over to his views a princess who, essentially impulsive, smarted already under a sense of what she regarded as Richelieu's ingratitude. Henry IV. Has left us a very suggestive appreciation of the character of his queen, whom, by the by, he never really loved. Having one day to write to Madame de Montglat, governess of the Dauphin, he said, "I have to complain of your not letting me know that you had whipped my son, for I mean and I command you to whip him whenever he persists stubbornly in anything wrong, as I know by experience that there is nothing better." Together with this letter he sent one to Mary de Medici containing the following remarkable words: "One thing I can assure you of, namely, that being of the disposition I know you to possess, and foreseeing that of your son, you, madam, self-willed and obstinate, he stubborn, you will certainly have difficulties together." Another contemporary writer described her as courageous, haughty, firm, discreet, vainglorious, obstinate, vindictive, and suspicious, inclined to idleness, caring little about state affairs, and loving only the pomp and honours of royalty. In his attempts to establish his authority and restore peace to a country so long distracted by civil wars, Richelieu had to meet not only the opposition of the Queen Mother, the apathy of Louis XIII., and the mischievous talents of the Duc d'Orléans, but the combined skill and unscrupulousness of a host of minor intriguers, who, with the view of satisfying their ambition, eagerly joined in all the plots organised against the safety of the state. The names of Mademoiselle de Montpensier, Madame de Longueville, Madame de Hautefort, Madame de Fiesque, which we find mentioned in almost every page of French memoir on the first half of the 17th century, remind us that ladies of rank did not hesitate to encourage rebellion, and to sacrifice to their selfish passions or to their wanton caprices the honour and the blood of thousands of brave men. We have just enumerated a few amongst those fatal beauties. The most distinguished amongst them, the representative one, if we may use such an expression, was the notorious Duchesse de Chevreuse, who, apparently born with the spirit of opposition and of cabal, intrigued against Mazarin as she did against Richelieu, was severely but justly punished by both, and astonished even Cardinal de Retz by the scandal of her conduct. We have selected her to form part of this gallery of portraits because she was the real soul of all the conspiracies which took place during the administration of Richelieu and the minority of Louis XIV, and her personality stands out with deplorable prominence amongst all those ladies of high birth who saw nothing beyond the full gratification of their desires. La Rochefoucauld, himself an adept in the art of conspiring, gives in his maxims selfishness as the motive power of all our actions. The civil dissensions which marked the beginning of the reign of Louis XIV taught him that sad lesson, and he could never have learned it more thoroughly than at the school of Madame de Chevreuse. It is singular that M. Victor Cousin, who blames Cardinal de Retz for being too severe in his appreciation of that lady, should have described her 200 years later in a manner which is not, after all, much more indulgent. Madame de Chevreuse, he says, possessed almost all the qualities of a good politician. Only one was lacking in her character, but precisely the one without which the others are nothing but a cause of ruin. She did not know how to select a proper object, or rather, she never made the selection for herself. It was made by another. She was in the highest degree a woman. That was both her strength and her weakness. Love, or rather gallantry, formed her leading motive of action, and the interest of him whom she loved became her principal object. This explains the prodigies of sagacity, of cunning, and of energy she displayed in the pursuit of a chimerical end which seemed always to recede before her, and which attracted her by the very prestige of difficulty and of danger. Such is M. Cousin's verdict. It is perhaps not so strongly expressed as that of the coadjutor, but it seems to us quite sufficient to condemn the Duchesse de Chevreuse. Pleasure led her about, says Madame de Motteville, and she interested herself in the affairs of the world only with reference to those who had been her lovers. Passion is a dangerous counsellor. Richelieu saw this, and he endeavoured to win over his fair enemy. His efforts were in vain. Such were the leading persons with whom Richelieu had to do in the course of his administration, which lasted for the space of 18 years. The abasement of the House of Austria, the destruction of the Huguenots as a political power at home, finally the curtailing of the monstrous privileges enjoyed by the aristocracy, to the accomplishment of these three objects Richelieu directed all his energy, and his first attempt was certainly well calculated to startle, not only Father de Bérulle, but the whole of a nation which was then sincerely attached to the Roman Catholic faith. That a cardinal should conclude a marriage between the sister of Louis XIII and the Prince of Wales, that he should sign a new treaty with the Dutch, subsidize secretly Mansfeld, who alone then resisted in Germany the House of Austria, finally, that he should send an army of 10,000 men for the purpose of driving the papal troops out of the Val Thelin and restoring it to the Grisons. Arrangements such as these, distinctly aimed against Spain and the Vatican, were important and novel enough to command the attention of the whole of Europe. They marked the inauguration of an entirely new system of foreign policy, and Richelieu could well afford to disregard the nickname of Pope of the Huguenots and Cardinal of Atheists, which the courtiers had given him, when he thought of the patriotic endeavour he was making to continue the traditions of Henry IV. "I am condemned now at Rome as a heretic," said he. I shall soon be canonized there as a saint." This short sentence was intended as a threat against the Protestants. Richelieu was fully determined upon crushing for ever what he deemed an imperium in imperio. He reorganised the army, built or purchased ships, and set aside as much money as he could from the exchequer to defray the costs of what might turn out to be a long and difficult campaign. The Treaty of Monson, which he concluded with Spain, left him free to act, and having thus made all his preparations, he waited for the opportunity of striking the fatal blow. It soon presented itself. End of Section 2.